which is different from the Institute for Community Integration. I'm based in Boston. I just want to check that the accessibility measures that we have in place are working for folks. So just to let folks know, we have captioning going right now. You can enable it to show up on the bottom of your screen or off to the side as a full transcript that you can search if you need to. We also have our wonderful ASL interpreter, Tracy. I just want to check, is Tracy spotlighted for folks right now or no?
I set multi-pin, so people should be able to find her, so she'd be spotlit.
Okay, wonderful. So if any issues come up, please feel free to note in the chat. I see at least one person saying she's not spotlit. Let me go ahead and see if I can enable that. There we go. So that should work for folks. If any other issues should emerge as we go on, much like Richard said with the questions, please feel free to just post those in the chat. You can, I think you might be able to direct the question right to me. And if not, you can just send it in the chat overall. But I'm going to be keeping track of questions, reading them aloud, and helping with any issues that should come up because we want to make sure folks can participate. And that only took 5 minutes. That's great. So I'll turn it over to Matthew.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I am about to start this presentation a way that when I was used to get graded on these things would lose me an entire letter grade. But I have to tell you up front, because I am a lawyer, that this is not legal advice. I am not your lawyer. Well, for the next about 55 minutes, we're going to have an educational conversation. And you would think that that sort of disclaimer is not really needed until one day you get a phone call from someone that was at a talk of yours saying, hey, since you're my lawyer. And since then, I take those very, very, very seriously. So a little bit about me. I'm a lawyer. I'm admitted to practice in Massachusetts and Oregon. I went to law school after I went to public health graduate school, and I did both of those things because an insurance company, when I was in college, tried to kill me by withholding medical care. Turned a prior authorization for fairly expensive medication that was supposed to take 72 hours into a 2.5 month long stonewalling bonanza is the best way I can describe it. And so that changed the course of my life. And instead of being a developmental psychologist, I am sitting in front of you as someone who went to public health school and law school in order to learn how to navigate these systems. My legal practice focused primarily on helping disabled folks, chronically ill folks, with things like insurance appeals, the prior authorizations that we were talking about, but also requesting reasonable accommodations from the K through 12, higher ed, and graduate school sort of experience, just from beginning to end. In these days, my professional hat, I'm a senior fellow at a place called Data for Progress, where I helm our US disability rights work. Before that, I worked at a place called Be a Hero with an activist named Adi Barkin, working on the fight for home care. So that's just a nutshell bio of me. If you have any questions, I'm going to be upfront with you. This is the first time I have given this talk since the before times. This is the first time I have given this talk in this pandemic hellscape that we all inhabit now. And so I don't know what sort of questions you have about that. And I really want to know. So I begin just by saying, please, I welcome your questions, comments. This can be more of a conversation if you want it to be. You can submit questions through chat. If you can unmute yourself or request being unmuted, I'm happy to do it that way if that's easier for you. Really want to make this as easy as possible. Having said all of that, and we're now at 8:08, which is about 2 minutes earlier than I would have bet. Let's dive in. I am guessing just from the before times that most people here have had the experience of requesting at least one reasonable, quote unquote, reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability. And I can see some people nodding. If you have your camera on, thank you. I appreciate it. You know, I do begin, I like to begin just so that we all have the same sort of basic background, talking about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. In the Rehab Act, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, are the two laws that cover most college students in the country. There are a couple of schools that don't take any federal money, and those couple of schools don't take any federal money so that they don't have to abide by federal disability civil rights laws and other civil rights laws. They really, really, really want to be able to discriminate against people. And this talk has nothing to do with them. If you're at one of those places, you're probably not here listening to someone like me. So put that aside. Let's talk about the ADA. Let's talk about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. They apply almost certainly to wherever it is you're going to school. Community college, four-year public college, four-year private college, graduate school, everywhere from, you know, Bristol Community College to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, right? The ADA applies. That may seem basic, but you do this work for a while, you will hear some wild things that university administrators lie to students about. Like, oh, we're a private school, the ADA doesn't apply to us. Here's the thing. If they take federal money, the ADA applies to them. And what do I mean by take federal money? I mean, is there a single student on that campus who has federal student aid, right? Did you fill out FAFSA to go to that school? They're taking federal money. There's also research, you know, professors who conduct research, if they're getting federal grants from NIH or any of those sorts of federal entities, they are taking federal money and the ADA applies. So if you're hearing like way too many of our folks have been told the ADA doesn't apply here, it's almost certainly a lie. Having said that, most of the other little lies, little fibs that the administrators would probably call them, are a little less blatant, right? And so we're often told that you needed to have an IEP or a 504 plan when you were in K through 12 in high school. You need to basically present materials from high school in order to get reasonable accommodations on the basis of disability. That is a lie. That is just a straight up 100% lie. If you're at a college, a university, whatever, you know, sort of higher educational institution you're at, you don't actually have to have had accommodations at the high school level in order to get them in college. That is a very, 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 very popular lie. And folks will believe it sometimes because the standardized tests that they make folks take, like the SAT or the LSAT or the MCAT, all of those sometimes will insist upon your full history of accommodations. You have to send in that package. Doesn't apply, does not apply. You do not need to do that in the higher education context. So that, I'm just going to start this by running through some lies because they invariably come up because people in higher education, I've got to tell you that the central thesis of this talk, my main point, do not assume that disability services, whatever they are called on your campus, that they are in your corner, that they are your friends, that they are going to ensure that you get the accommodations that federal law guarantee you. So that's where I start from, right? That if you take nothing else away from this talk, that is the thing I hope you take away. I am seeing a question Marie Schmidt says, even other college doesn't provide interpreter. I'm not sure what you mean. Would you, if you want to say a little bit more, I would love to try to take a swing at answering that. And maybe while you do, I'll say that the horror stories, I am sure if we went around this Zoom room, many of you could tell me some, I'll try to keep this PG, some BS that you have been told by disability services people on your campus or your former campus. That's where I come from, having, experienced some of those little lies when I was in school. So that is the central thesis and the thing that I hope you take away. And now I want to talk a little bit about what we do about it, right?
May I, Matthew,
yeah.
may I interrupt here? So
Of course.
Marie would like to add her comments here.
Please.
Okay, so I'm sorry to interrupt your presentation. However, in the past where I have worked, they have suggested that I go to college to receive more education, which is fine. So when I try to enroll, go to register, etc., they have me take tests, as you mentioned. I have to prove this, prove that, show this documentation, and more tests, right? So even if I'm working at the college. So what happened later is that I asked if they would provide sign language interpreters so that I can get my education. And they said, no, sorry, we don't have one in that area where, in that hometown or where, I was going to school. Like, we don't have one. So that's why I moved here to where I am now. I mean, my same college from 40 years ago. I mean, this is the third time I've come to this college because I love it. It's the best one. So I was frustrated where I was before, wasting my time trying to get an education from that college where I was working. I mean, the college was paying for my classes because I was an employee there, but they couldn't provide interpreters.
Is this college in the United States of America?
Yes, actually, Florida.
Then the
On the
Americans
East Coast.
Then the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, as amended by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 2008, almost certainly applies to this school if they take any sort of federal money. The caveat is there are like 3 schools. I do not ever remember them off the top of my head. One of them functions as some sort of ranch. The students are also ranchers. It's weird to me because I would get to that school and within 48 hours, you'd find my lifeless corpse out with the horses. Not my scene. But having said that, if it's one of the 99.99% of colleges in the United States that is covered by the ADA, and you have a disability, and we can talk a little bit more about what that means, what counts as a disability, but being deaf is unquestionably.
Right, I'm deaf, actually, obviously. I mean, there I am.
Yep.
Straight
But generally when we think about this, you think, is the school covered by the ADA? Is the person covered by the ADA? Meaning, usually, do they have what the ADA considers to be a disability? Being deaf is, without any question, since 1990, a disability under the ADA. And then you think, well, what is the accommodation that is being requested? In this case, it is an interpreter or interpreters. It's basically interpreting as.
And again, the company was paying for my school, but they refused to provide interpreters. The college refused to provide interpreters, even though I was working there and I'd worked there for 8 years. So,
yeah. So we have a covered school covered by the ADA. We have a disability that counts within the meaning of the ADA. And then someone in the chat just said it. It's not showing me your name. I'm so sorry. What if they say it is a financial burden to hire an interpreter? So so normally the way this works, you make a request, because in the K through 12 space, when you're in high school, it's if you're in a public school system, it's the school systems, they sort of have a duty to try to figure out if you have a qualifying disability. Once you get to higher ed, the burden shifts and the duty is on the student to disclose the disability and request an accommodation. Yeah, Marie did that, asked for an interpreter, and the ADA says essentially that you have that is a standard sort of accommodation. That's like core ADA accommodations. I have not heard. That does not mean that this has not happened. It does not mean this has not happened, but I have not heard of a institution of higher education, a community college, a four-year college, private, public, whatever the case may be, successfully argue that providing ASL interpreters is unreasonable, because the core of what we're talking about is, and this is how the ableists try to screw us over, to be blunt about it, it's that word reasonable. Accommodations have to be reasonable. And what they'll say, the way that the ADA is set up, is that if an accommodation is too expensive, it can be unreasonable. So what does too expensive look like? If you needed an accommodation, if you were asking for an accommodation that was going to cost $5 million a year, it's hard to see how that wouldn't be a financial burden on most schools. But something like an ASL interpreter, I don't know any interpreters making $5 million a year. I'd be switching jobs right now, right? Marie, do you know any interpreters making $5 million a year?
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it?
It really would. I sign up for that future. That's a future I would love. But when the college, the standard move for a college is to argue that an accommodation request is unreasonable, and one of the ways they have to do that is by saying it would be too expensive. It would be an undue financial burden to provide that accommodation. That is fairly standard. And so, in that sort of circumstance, you have a few options. And this is something we'll keep coming back through, I'm guessing, through our remaining time. But one is the United States Department of Education has an office called the Office for Civil Rights. It's shorthanded to OCR. U.S. Department of Education, OCR, is the federal agency charged with enforcing complaints about disability discrimination in higher education. The person who runs that office is appointed by the president. It's a sub-cabinet position. They have to get confirmed by the Senate. It's a big deal, important job. Right now, the person who holds that job, how do I put this? During the last administration, I did not get the sense that the person who held that job was particularly interested in doing that job. But the person there now, the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights, is serious about her job. And there is an online complaint form. That's usually where I send people who need to lodge a complaint, just because I think it's easier. You can take your time. You can look at the form, look it over, see what the questions are. You can write out your answers in a Google document or longhand, whatever works best for you. Think about it, really compose the story, make sure the timeline is right. You submit a complaint and they assign an investigative team. Usually it's 2 people. There's someone whose job it is to go out and find facts sort of an investigator. And then there's a lawyer. That's the investigatory team. I see the question, Tracy. I will include that here. The investigatory team, and they will reach out to the school and say, one of your students has asked for this reasonable accommodation. They're telling us that they asked for the reasonable accommodation. Did they? And, this is why I always suggest when you ask for a reasonable accommodation, if you're doing it, make sure you're doing it in writing as well. You can go to an office, you can have a meeting, but you want a piece of paper and you want some emails so that you can say to OCR, hey, this is the reasonable accommodation I requested. And then OCR turns to the school and says, well, what's your reply? Did the person request this accommodation? Yes. And if you're not going to grant the accommodation, why not? OCR has the power, if they think that the school has done something wrong, to essentially force the school to comply. There's a question in the chat that asks, is OCR really our only go-to, nothing more immediate? So this is where things get a little bit tricky because it depends on what state you're in. And I don't know the situation for all 50 states plus the District of Columbia in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, but many states have a state agency whose job it is to enforce state laws about disability discrimination. And you would have to, on your own, look up whether or not your state has such a state agency. In Massachusetts, we have something called the Massachusetts Commission Against Discrimination that also takes these sorts of complaints. So the first place I would go is I'd go to Google and find out what agency, if any, in your state enforces disability rights laws. Those are the two places you can go sort of in the government. There is a third option. They are very, very, policymakers are very fond about telling us about this option, that you can hire a lawyer and you can sue on your own. And they really just gloss over the fact that lawyers are like $500 an hour. And most college students don't have $500 an hour to hire a lawyer. So OCR is really the first line of defense. And for many of our folks, the only line of defense, but in line with private lawyer, there are, again, this is state by state, and I hate that it's state by state, but that is just the reality of the way the rules work. The law changes from every state to state, and so lawyers are licensed on a state by state basis. You can look at whether your state has more than one disability rights sort of law firm, right? So every state has what is called a protection and advocacy agency. They go by PNAs for short. Very rarely, in my experience, does an individual college student present a case to a PNA that PNA is going to take up. It happens sometimes, and it's worth doing. If you have no other options and you are being denied an accommodation or otherwise being discriminated against on the basis of disability, I don't think it hurts to reach out to your state's protection and advocacy agency. And I would literally just Google the name of your state and protection and advocacy agency to find them, or NCCSD has some info in the chat. There's a link. If there is, in my experience, the PNAs are unfortunately underfunded, overworked. There's a lot of, as I think everyone on this call probably knows, there's a lot of disability discrimination in this country, and there ain't enough money to fight it. The government doesn't really like paying disability lawyers to fight disability discrimination, if you can imagine that. So the PNAs are a good place to start, but be prepared for them to say, we really don't have the kind of capacity that would allow us to take your case. unless they're getting a lot of complaints about a campus. So there's a group of students at a private university at Yale. Yale was in the news recently because Yale has this practice of forcing students with mental health issues to take an involuntary leave of absence because they don't want them on campus. That has happened to enough students that they sort of banded together, they found each other, and they got representation. So if there's a systemic issue, you might have better luck with the Protection and Advocacy Agency. If you can find other folks who have been discriminated against by your campus and you present that as a package to a PNA, there might be more likelihood for them to take that sort of case. The other thing that sometimes may exist, there are, and this is just highly regional, just really highly regional. There are nonprofit law organizations, and there may be one in your area that is interested, but that you just can't count on that because it is just incredibly regional. So you've got OCR at the federal level. If you're in a good state, and they tend to be blue states, but not always, so it's always worth checking. You might have a state agency that is charged with enforcing disability discrimination laws, anti-disability discrimination laws. You may have a PNA agency that is interested, and then you may have some sort of nonprofit, sort of disability conscious nonprofit pro bono law organization in your area that might be interested. Those are the 4 places that most people find if they're going to find help without paying for it out of pocket. Those are the 4 places that most people are likely to find help. I wish there were more. It is absurd, ludicrous, I would add vile and evil that the ADA basically relies on disabled folks to enforce it. There is no ADA, police force that we can call up or lawyer force or whatever the feds would do, but that we can call up to say we're being discriminated against. It really relies on individual disabled people fighting to enforce the ADA, and that's one of the sort of major features, one of the major things about the ADA. So that in the higher ed space, those are the 4 places I would go if I was told that I couldn't have an interpreter as a student. If you are also an employee, things get real complicated, because sometimes that could be disability discrimination in the employment context. And then you're looking at your state probably has a different state agency for labor law, disability discrimination. You've got the Department of Labor at the federal level. Like it's a different world. And sometimes local lawyers are more likely to take those cases because sometimes there's the better opportunity for money damages. So the last thing I will say that may be helpful, Marie, is that oftentimes lawyers who do this sort of work will give you a 30-minute consultation for free. And because you're also an employee, it may be worth talking to employment discrimination lawyer in your state about this. I am seeing a follow-up question from Sandra Friedman. Is there any organization that has a list of private lawyers that have been vetted? If there is, I don't know about it. If there is, I don't know about it. What I would say is there are sometimes depending on the state, there might be an organization for like disability rights lawyers to join, but there's not going to be like a vetting process. And so you can find folks who are interested in that sort of work, but the bar would say that admission to the bar is the vetting process, and that's BS, just to be blunt about it, but that's what they would say. Stephanie Polito says, my family and I had to hire a lawyer to come to my IEP meeting, and it was a lot of work. It was a lot of work. The teachers and staff were not accommodating my needs. I got discrimination from my school. The disability students had their classroom in the basement. So yes. First of all, Stephanie, I'm sorry that happened to you. It shouldn't. No one should need a lawyer to just exist as a disabled person and try to get an education in this country. But unfortunately, that's what, for a lot of folks, it comes down to. One place to find lawyers who do this sort of work, you know, they may focus on the K through 12 space, but also be familiar with higher education. There's the sense is amongst attorneys, not to speak for all of us, but my understanding of the sense amongst attorneys is that there are more people who can pay the lawyer's fee in the K through 12 space than there is in the higher ed space. Because I mean, college students are just broke, right? Like I'm flashing back to undergrad last year of my junior year. I had bagels because that's what there was money for, just bagels and peanut butter. Like we're broke. And so one place you can find, you know, referrals and in discussions of disability education, disability lawyers might be the Facebook group for your town, where the parents talk about IEP meetings and 504 plans. That's the sort of resource we're looking at, instead of some sort of official body that vets people. It's really word of mouth, for lack of a better phrase. And Tracy W says, you definitely want to ask around. Exactly, Tracy. We had a lawyer who knew nothing when we tried to fight K through 12 school system. Exactly. Unfortunately, I don't want to get too into the weeds of what it means to be a disabled lawyer. I want to talk about what you want to talk about, but it's real hard to be a disabled person and get to practice law. And there ain't a lot of us. It's hard, and we need to work on that so that there are more lawyers who actually care about getting it right for disabled students. And okay. Thank you, Marie. It was a fabulous question, a great jumping off point. I wanted to, my guess is, in those of you who have your camera on, you can nod your head if I'm wrong. If you have your camera off, you can put a thumbs down emoji in the chat. I wanted to talk a little bit about COVID and disability on campus right now. If that is of no interest, please, boo me in the chat, or shake your head no. But most of the people that I've been talking to about disability accommodations this year are quite rightly and quite understandably scared for their lives or their family members' lives, because there is a pandemic that has killed more than 1 million Americans. That is, despite whatever nonsense comes out of the mouth of Joe Biden, still very much going on, still very much here, still is killing about, on average, 300 people a day, and is something that disabled students, particularly immunocompromised or chronically ill folks, but as we know from the data at this point, we've got about 3 years of it, folks with a lot of different sorts of disabilities are increased risk of getting COVID, and at increased risk, if they should get COVID, of a bad outcome. And as I tell university administrators when I talk to them, when we're talking about COVID and bad outcomes, we mean death. We mean death. And there is been a backlash to the sorts of accommodations that universities pivoted to when 2020 came through. And in order to keep the lights, keep money flowing into the bank account, don't use the euphemism, Matthew, they keep money flowing into the bank account, they had to pivot to Zoom view, right? And before, we were always told remote instruction is not a reasonable accommodation. It changes fundamentally the nature of the educational experience. And the ADA says we don't have to fundamentally change the nature of the educational experience. But then there were shutdown orders and there were no vaccines. And so they pivoted to Zoom. And a couple of years later, they all want to move on with their lives. And so they did away with Zoom and they forced everyone back to campus. And they kept masks for about 6 months. And then they said, no, we can't make anyone wear a mask. It's a violation of their individual liberties. It's not fair. It's not fair. You don't have a right to make anyone wear a mask. I am not getting booed in the chat, so we're going to talk about this for a little while because they're lying to you. If you are someone who has a condition that is on that CDC list that flew around the disability community when they first put it out, of disabilities and conditions. And it's everything from ADHD to being, sort of a wide variety of chronic illnesses to it's a whole long list of stuff that is so long I do not have it memorized. If you have a disability that's on that list and you ask for reasonable accommodations on the basis of that disability, it is likely, based on what I've seen and what colleagues have seen, that you have been told basically, we're not going to do anything for you. So let's talk about it. First of all, if your school has told you that they're not doing reasonable accommodations for COVID, and this is a thing that I've been told in writing by some very well-resourced schools with billions of dollars of endowment. I am not talking about an HBCU in the South with no money trying to keep the lights on. I am talking about historically white serving institutions with $8, $9, $10 billion in the bank have said, we are not doing accommodations for COVID. That's not a lawful position, right? If you've gotten an email like that, my first thing I would say to you is you should really consider forwarding that to the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, because that's the sort of blanket denial of civil rights that will impact a lot of students that they're going to prioritize, I would hope. If you've gotten some individualized nonsense, like in the chat here, Ollie says, yeah, just about no one on my campus masks anymore. And as a chronically ill student, I can only do so much wearing my own mask when people around me are sick and coughing with no mask. I also have to worry for my older parents who have their own conditions. And the lack of online options means that I miss much more time due to health flares and have to teach myself parts of the material. It's just a lot. LOL. You are right. It is a lot. You can ask. There is nothing stopping you, legally speaking, from asking that everyone in every class that you're in wears a mask. There's a case, a federal district court case in Virginia, Fairfax, Virginia. A bunch of K through 12 parents sued because the new governor of Virginia, a Trumpy sort of Republican COVID denier by the name of Glenn Youngkin, said that you can't make students wear masks. And so the parents got together and sued. And so there's this case in Virginia in district court that says, actually, you can ask other students to, you can make the mask as a reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability. There's a lot of news coverage. There are a lot of press releases. There's a decision. So you can ask your college as a reasonable accommodation on the basis of disability, because I have chronic illnesses that put me at higher risk of COVID. I'm asking that everyone in the classrooms with me wear a mask. The other thing that you could ask for is increased ventilation, because we know ventilation decreases the risk that COVID is a virus. It's this aerosol. Think of it like cigarette smoke. It's a good way to think about it. You can do ventilation. I've sent some college students this is a little CO2 meter. It's really high because I'm locked in my office by myself. I've got no windows open, the door is closed, so that you can't hear my partner rocking out to Beyonce doing Peloton.
Would you mind explaining what that does, Matthew?
I'm about to. Yep. So what this is measuring is the amount of CO2 in the air, and CO2 is what we breathe out. It is the gas that we exhale. And so this is a way of measuring how much fresh air is coming into my room, the space with me. The higher this number is, the less fresh air is coming into this room. The lower this number is, the more fresh air is coming into this room. And we know conclusively, we know definitively that fresh air sort of dilutes the virus, the aerosol. It's much safer to breathe the air in a room with other people in a shared indoor air space when the CO2, when there's good ventilation. So this is just a way of trying to measure ventilation in a room. This particular little white box is fairly expensive. There are cheaper ones on Amazon, like $30, $40 that you can use to measure how good ventilation is on campus in a classroom. The other thing people can request as a reasonable accommodation is air filters, like HEPA air filters, or if you look online, you Google the term CR box. It is this wonderful cube that is made out of high quality furnace filters and a box fan. And there is peer-reviewed science proving that it lowers the amount of infectious aerosol in a room. So those are things that you can ask for that are short of online classes. It is probably the case that if you said to a college or a university, look, I'm really immunocompromised. You used to offer all these online courses. I want to do my courses online. And they say, well, we don't offer online courses anymore, or we don't offer the courses you need to graduate, or the prereqs that you need to get to the courses you need to graduate. We don't do those online. We've never done them online. They would say that it's a burden and therefore not reasonable to offer an online section just for you. Jeff is messaging me, so I know how much time I've got left. Give it up for Jeff. He's good at his job. I appreciate it. Thank them. So that is the sort of so everyone wearing masks, filtration, ventilation, making, there've got to be rooms that have windows that can open on campus, right? Like you don't need to be in an interior room in a library for a course. Those are the sorts of things that are reasonable. There's a question. Do you know of any resources that include example of reasonable accommodations that students can request? Do you mean in the COVID context or just generally? I can't scroll up anymore to see who asked that question. I'm sorry, generally. Yeah. So there's a whole world of material out there, and it's not written for students. Just want to be clear up front. Their audience are the people who are paid money to reject requests at disability services. But there are, if you search, one of the place I would probably start is the Great Lakes ADA Center, weirdly enough. They are at, you know what, I'm just going to drop this. I think I can drop this in the chat. I would start with that PDF. I would start with that PDF. And if you are at a university that is fairly hostile to disability rights, the other thing I would do, OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, has, I believe they still call it a reading room. They do. The OCR reading room, where you're going to have to click through a bit, but you can find the reports that OCR generates when they resolve a complaint, and you can look to see if there have been complaints against your school in particular. That is a fascinating thing to do, and I highly recommend it, particularly if they've been telling you a bunch of nonsense. Look to see if OCR has paid them a visit recently. I find sometimes going and having a meeting with the director of disability services with a printout, from the last decade or so of cases that OCR found against them can change their tune really quickly. Just go back to the chat here. There was something else that I missed. I'm wondering if schools can support having nut-free areas because there may be one or a few of students who have allergies. Why can't masking be enforced for students who are immunocompromised? It's an excellent point, Helen. You are exactly right. If you were to request as a reasonable accommodation because you are immunocompromised that people in your courses wear masks, you might point out that schools often have nut-free areas because being around nuts can cause anaphylaxis in a variety of people. And so why can't they do masking? How are we doing? Is this helpful? How are folks feeling about this? I want to use the last 9 minutes that we have together well. I will zoom ahead and give you, I will zoom ahead and give you my closing top tips. First, again, if you take nothing away from this, other than this, it will have been a success. Disability services, the people that work there report to a university that fundamentally is almost certainly hostile to disability rights, right? Like their job is to do the minimum required to comply with the law. Any college or university could grant every disability request that it wanted to. There's nothing in the law that prevents that. They do the bare minimum that the law requires. And so you don't need to be overtly hostile. You don't need to treat them with disrespect. Be polite, be courteous, but get everything in writing. You never talk on the phone to these people. If you do, you send them an email when you hang up and say, hey, thanks so much for the phone call. I want to make sure that I really understood what we just talked about. I understood you to be saying that I can have the university will provide air filters for this room, this room, this room, and this room that I take a course in. Can you just make sure that, can you get back to me and make sure that I've understood this right? You put everything in writing. You don't trust these people. You don't trust these people. You get everything in writing. If they insist on a phone call, you follow up with an email. If they take too long you nag them. You nag them 7 days. That's what they should, like, in my view, you get a week. Semester's not that long, right? If I've submitted a request and you haven't gotten back to me in a week, you're getting a follow-up email. And if you keep prevaricating, if you keep giving me the runaround, you know, for me, you would
Yeah.
get an email saying, hey, do I need to submit a complaint to the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education in order to get your bosses, you know, off your back? You make it seem like you're doing them a favor, but really you're making it clear that you know that you have civil rights and that there's an agency in the federal government that is supposed to enforce those rights for you. In the times of COVID, what I would say is that you are probably not alone. There are other immunocompromised, chronically ill, and disabled students on your campus. We are 25% of the US population. You know, immunocompromised people are about 3% of the population, but you add us all together and we're about 25%. And if there are other folks that you know who are not being accommodated in this pandemic hellscape with very common sense, science-backed, evidence-based interventions that would improve your safety and their safety, get together, make a request to Disability Services. If they say no, go to OCR together. Go to OCR together. Every one of you submits a complaint. We have strength in numbers, is my point. It is a great lesson from the people who are our elders in this movement, who came before us, who fought together, who crawled up the Capitol. Like we could do the whole disability history thing, but we only have like 4 minutes. So just fill that in your head for me. When the people in these sorts of positions of authority and power see that we know each other and we talk to each other and we act together, they tend to take us more seriously. I am looking at the chat here, and we'll wrap this up. If anyone has any closing questions or comments, drop them in the chat or unmute yourself or whatever you would like. What the last thing I would say, the very last thing I would say is that Helen, I don't understand your question. What you mean by policy? If you want to take another whack at it, I will just say this while you do that. If you are a disabled college student, particularly right now, and you're still going, what I want you to know is that I'm impressed AF. It's hard. And the people who run stuff don't give a care about us. And in this hellscape, it's even harder. But we need you. Like, I am rooting for your success because it is lonely out here. We need more disabled professionals. We need more disabled professionals. We need more disabled women and non-binary and professionals. We need more disabled professionals of color. It is awfully white in the disabled professional space, way too white. It is lonely, and you are doing great things just by fighting the fights that you are fighting on campus to get the education that you should be getting without having to fight. And so it sucks. And I'm sorry that we have to have conversations like this, but it matters. And you're doing things. 3 to 5 year updated diagnostic information requirement. Yeah, so it depends on the type. That's usually going to be what the school considers to be a learning disability type thing. Okay. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to copy the questions that I'm not going to have a chance to get to. Right now, I'm putting them into a notepad document. And if you look at Twitter, my username is @MattBC. I will take some time within the next 24 to 48 hours to take a stab at questions that I just couldn't get to in the chat. And I just copied into a Word doc. You can look at me on Twitter. Thank you so much, Jeff. I will take a stab at some of these questions that we didn't get a chance to get to. And with that, I think we're at time. And I just, before we go, want to thank our interpreter.
A quick
Thank
question
you.
though, how do we save the transcript? Someone's asking.
Jeff, ICI, someone help?
Actually, I can answer that. After the Zoom is ended, the transcript gets saved over here at ICI, so we could get that to you. I think here.
Right, that would be very helpful to me because I may have missed some things that people were saying, and that would be very helpful for me.
Okay, let me put my email in the chat for NCCSD.
Yeah, and I believe the best way to contact Matthew is through Twitter, primarily. If you're not already, please subscribe to DREAM and NCCSD's listserv. Unfortunately, because we didn't do pre-registration, because this is our first event in a very long time, and we were so excited to have Matthew, we don't have everybody's email addresses recorded. So what we will do is we will send out an email to the listserv saying, here is where you can find the recording and here's the transcript as well. We hope to do more great events like this in the future, but this will be hard to follow. Thank you again, Matthew, for being here with us, sharing your knowledge, speaking to real issues and the hard issues, but also the hope that comes with bringing disabled folks together, which is at the core of what DREAM is about, and so many other groups out there. And with that, we are at 9 p.m. Eastern time. And thank you, everybody, so much for being here. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to end the call now.